recap. Hi everyone, this is the Static Site Editor Design and Product meeting, and we are jumping in progress mid-conversation. So I'll recap a little bit. It is July 13th, 2020, and we were just talking about the potential future directions for the Static Site Editor as it relates to whether we're building a CMS or a live page editing experience or something else. And I was just recapping some of the diagrams that the diagram I had made last week. So I'm going to share my screen again. I think I'm gonna find there. So again, we're here in this diagram. We're building a production page that sends, or we're trying to connect to a production page that's a static site, send the data that's linked to a repository in the back end, so we know which data to send. Right now, Markdown and Ruby templates would send the data. The Markdown would get parsed into this WYSIWYG single page editor, and edits result in a merge request. Pretty simple flow, and there's a pretty clear line for iteration and improvement on that user experience, just in making that WYSIWYG mode more powerful and able to handle different types of content, either media content or like image tools for optimizing images and mermaid diagrams and things like that, handling like potentially even referencing other files, like other pages and includes and things like that. We can get pretty fancy with it, but it's all just kind of building on top of the single page editing experience. And then we have this is relevant because this is sort of a UX research task right now, but we have pretty clear understanding that we need to work on a workflow that allows you to edit multiple pages at once within one MR, and also potentially perform multiple edits on a single page on multiple sessions. So like the idea of saving a draft and coming back later, picking up your work where you left off, or maybe after you create the MR, you want to come back and refine it in the static site editor. Those workflows aren't really possible right now, so we want to make those possible. A little bit further down the line, we have like a preview using the production CSS, so like a live preview or block editor, page builder experience. These are a little fuzzier, but these would just be extensions on the editing and previewing experience. And then it gets a little more interesting, and I think there's a few directions we can take. I'm actually gonna, for the sake of time, skip over direction B, which is just like we could just be a mode of the web IDE, a more visual editing mode of the web IDE. This would probably require us extending Monaco or like adding a layer on top of Monaco editor, which is what they use. I don't love this direction because it kind of limits our iteration path. It starts to feel like we're just adding a feature on top of somebody else's feature rather than building out something really useful for a large amount of users. So, but it's still a valid option. It might be where we hit. The live page editing experience, this would be similar to what we talked about with Tina CMS, and we saw this on StackBit with their live page editor. But in this scenario, the little purple header means we're in GitLab, and underneath the GitLab product umbrella, you would configure your page probably within GitLab, but then package and deploy it onto your CDN of choice, whether that's Pages and GitLab, or maybe, you know, Netlify or somewhere else. And then on your production site, you'd have an edit button, edit link. We would handle the auth, but then embed the editing experience on your production site, whether that's running in like a Kubernetes container or something, or it's live JavaScript. That's all to be determined. There's a lot of hand waving here, but this is the Tina CMS approach, right? It gets a little more complicated when you start talking about like adding new pages and jumping between pages and authoring draft content, things like that, but we would explore it within this confine. Maybe there's like a lightweight CMS basically on the flip side of your production page. And I think option C is kind of the mirror image of that, which is we just kind of adopt the pages concept. This is just a proposal. This is not firm or even a good idea necessarily, but if we took the concept of pages and maybe made it top level, like you're hosting your site on pages. Now you have a little bit of configuration for your URL, but you also configure your page templates and your static site generator of choice and your other configuration options, like what language of Markdown you want to use, or what flavor of Markdown, things like that. And then within that top level configuration, you also define your data source. So then we can kind of just iterate over that data source and build a rudimentary sitemap and let you drill into those pages and present the static site editor for each of those pages. Then we can get really fancy. We could have advanced tools and integrations. We could bring in the actual web IDE or the editor Lite as our inline code editor. We could have a visual editor for working with data files like tables for YAML and JSON, things like that. And then the last bit on this before I stop to recap is that long-term, 2 to 5 years from now, maybe there's an option for both of these to converge. So whichever direction we take, I don't think it precludes the other one, but I think we need to invest in one before we, or at least, research our way into making a decision on one that's more valuable, because limited resources and just focus. And then eventually, if we find it's useful, for example, if we chose direction C and we made a headless CMS and inside GitLab, we could then also, similar to what Forestry has done, have an open source project that embeds the same experience on your site or something like that for those modern static site generators that would be capable of like running that JavaScript environment. So I'm thinking like Gatsby or something like that, where we don't need to worry about like middleman or some of the legacy static site generators that might not be capable of running that development environment in like a JavaScript container. So anyway, that's what I presented last week for Lauren and Catherine. That's the Eclipse Notes version. There's a recording of it. We talked about it a little bit more before. I haven't added anything to this since then, but it just shows like where we might be headed. And obviously at each one of these points, we'll be validating and iterating and doing research and getting feedback from users.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting because all static sites, their content's going to be in Markdown or data files. So allowing users to edit that content within GitLab would be really powerful.
Yeah, and I think one of the decision points for me is going to be in research outside of GitLab. So with users that might be hosting their static site editors already, or the static sites already on Netlify or GitLab or GitHub. The real question for me is, where is the most effective place for these personas to be making the edits? Is it a custom built CMS like interface within the GitLab product, or do we need to kind of plant a stake in the ground and say that's actually the old way of doing things and like the old way of thinking, and the modern way of editing is all editing live on the page, and we'll just try and figure that out. But I don't know yet. So that's where we need to start pulling on the threads and figuring out where the best place what's the best entry point into the editing experience, and what makes the most sense. But yeah, that was not on the agenda, but it is something that we talked about before, and I wanted to recap for you. So open obviously to any feedback on that. There's not really an issue, but I guess we could just use the category strategy maturity to discuss this. Obviously the agenda doc is open if you want to leave feedback on it. The only 2 points I had to talk about today, we started talking about this a little bit, so I'll jump to number 2, is I mentioned this on the call earlier, the marketing team is putting together a list of requirements for CMS to drive the marketing site. as we move to a mono repo structure. Our handbook site is very much coming together as a well-defined set of content. Separate from that, everything else on the site could be better served on a CMS, or having a little more enterprise level management features or something like that. So they're drafting these requirements. I'm supportive of either direction. I don't think that we as a static site editor group should push our feature to be included in consideration for something that it's clearly not suited for yet. And it could be multiple years before it gets to that level. I don't want to put undue pressure, but at the same time, I'm always interested in more feedback and dog fooding opportunities. So if there is a way we can make it work, I'm happy to do so. I think I summarized it earlier by saying I'm not going to dictate the marketing team's solution any more than I want them to dictate my roadmap and say, like, we need these features now, whether you're ready for them or not. So that's.
Is there a timeline on the decision to make the CMS recommendation or decision on the marketing side?
It got pushed to this Friday. So if you have feedback and comments, please add your comments to the issues. I'll put them in our agenda.
Yeah, there's a couple links in the earlier meeting today. I'll just surface them up. I think the timeline for making a decision on whether we should pursue a CMS is this week, and then there's going to be, if it's a go, it would be investigation into which one, and then how long is it going to take to implement, and who's going to help, whether it's possible to do internally or we need to engage a vendor or something like that. So I think it's my understanding is it's a project that would likely move into Q3 or Q4 as far as implementation goes, but the decision is happening shortly. And the only other topic I wanted to bring up from a product standpoint, which is kind of interesting, was a conversation that happened at the end of last week related to formatting of Markdown, and actually spurred from Michael your question on one of the merge requests about preference of using dash versus asterisk on the unordered list markup. And for those that are watching this that might not know, which I can't imagine there would be, but that's both valid Markdown syntax, and you can use them interchangeably as long as they're used exclusively within a list. You can actually use them interchangeably within a file, and it'll parse out a bullet in either way. We have a documented GitLab approach. A preference, I should say, for writing handbook and documentation, and that's to use a hyphen. The reason I didn't catch it is because my personal preference is to use an asterisk, and I was like, oh great, this is formatting it perfectly. But Michael correctly pointed out that I was actually inconsistent in writing my description, because I wrote the correct GitLab preference and then proceeded to forget when I was actually editing. So we're working on getting them consistent. Enrique and Derek have an approach already defined that will allow us to tweak the Toast UI Markdown converter to follow the handbook preferences. And then we've already started talking about making it something that can be defined in a configuration file or something passed in from the user to define their preferences. So right now we're focused on making it work for the handbook, and then shortly we'll investigate overrides for that. So if you could pass in preferences for using bullet type, there was like a number of indents, like whether or not you increment the numbered list. There's a few others in that issue that are really stylistic preferences. They're not necessarily extensions of Markdown. They're just different ways of writing it. And the reason all behind this is if you had a Markdown file that already existed and you wrote it all using asterisks for your unordered list, and you bring it into the static site editor, it's going to convert all those to hyphens because it's looking for, it's parsing the Markdown properly, but it turns it into HTML and then back to Markdown. But it goes back to Markdown using the preferences defined in that converter, which in this case would be a hyphen. And that would result in a noisy merge request in that there's changes that you didn't intend to make. And if you are very passionate about one preference or the other, it could actually make you really annoyed. So that's the context there. It's looking good. They're working on it. There's a solution already in place. There's issues linked in the agenda doc below, I believe, Enrique's point number 1 on the earlier meeting today. And that's it for me.
Cool. For the design side, I think the big thing on the plate is like the internal solution validation of editing the handbook. So the scope of this is to understand, so we're looking at taking some of the fields that you would populate in a merge request and trying to pull them into the static site editor so that you can bring it into one, integrate it into the flow better. So that's one of the goals of the research, is to take a look at, are we including the right fields in the right way so that you can do everything you need to do for a merge request directly from the static site editor. So trying to keep the user in that world. So that's one point. The other point is looking at how we handle multiple pages per edit. So at the moment, the static site editor only handles one page edit, and then you create a merge request, and that gets sent through to GitLab. What we're looking at exploring in this solution validation is this idea of allowing a user to select an existing MR to base their changes from. So this way you can change multiple pages. I guess the big question here is like this this idea of like if we should abstract all the way through a merge request instead of branch. So there's or is it good to have changes on a branch level? So this kind of complexity, like are we gauging it at the right level? Are we abstracting too much away, or are we still using such technical terms that it's still daunting, or like it brings another level of confusion to the world of GitLab and editing the handbook? Updating the issue at the moment on that, and padding up the prototype. Last week I got Qualtrics going, but Catherine was kind enough to take a look at some of those questions and refine them out. So appreciate that. I guess, yeah, pretty much the questions are there. So I guess that can go live now and we can recruit internally, but yeah, I'm not 100% sure on the differences on recruiting internally and externally, if it's as formal or is it more casual, like the first round of solution validation that we did back in May, April, May. So yeah, that's kind of like the stuff on the design side.
Yeah, that's great. And I posted a link to a Slack discussion that I had this morning. I woke up to this one from Jason, who has been using it internally. And he basically asked for exactly what you were saying, is a little bit of extra context to provide with the MR. But he's asking from the standpoint of somebody here internally who knows what's going on and actually reads the change log and looks at it and sees that there are MRs that don't really follow best practices for being descriptive, which is totally valid, and we knew that was an issue. So yeah, just a little bit of extra validation there that this is something internal users want. I'm sure he'd be willing to test the prototype.
Yep, cool. Yeah. 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 people.
Yeah.
Now we just need 5 more.
Yeah, to answer your question about recruiting, so it definitely is much more informal for internal studies. I would say, generally speaking, you don't need to create a screener survey unless there are a series of questions that you want people to answer in order to participate. So say it's not open to everyone in the company and you want, the right people to participate, then you can create a question that asks about the tools they're using or whether they're experienced with something. But generally speaking, you can reach out to people you want to participate in, just similar to the previous study you did. And I would just say, try not to go within the team too much because, yeah, they have that higher level of awareness of what's going on. But it seems like a lot of the target users would be outside of the team. So maybe that's not as much of a concern for this area, but I would just keep that in mind.
Yeah, I guess from my side, it's like I don't know who to reach out to, so it's like I rather like that's why the screener is there. Or maybe if you can point me to some people, then yeah, I'm happy to reach out directly. But yeah, I just don't know who.
Yeah, if you don't know who, then that makes sense too.
I mean, I can get you a list of internal people that might be good, maybe different ones than what we interviewed before. I can think of a few, but I think it's going to be really helpful to hear shortly from external users or potential users externally. So recruiting there is going to get a lot trickier. So we don't have a giant pool of users to pull from.
Yeah, so that bigger one, that kind of like the external looking one is probably some of the other research issues that are on like kind of drafted up, not really as formally filled out, is like the ones around looking at other opportunities of the like static site editor. So maybe we can get going on that, because I guess recruiting for externals will be tougher. So maybe we have a separate thing called to discuss that in more detail. So that we can give like time for recruitment, because that's always the time consuming bit.
Yeah, I was curious about that one, if you have a timeline in mind for that issue.
Me, I don't know if there's like any hard timeline. I think, yeah, maybe Eric, you can jump in with this, but like from my point of view on it is maybe in the next 1 or 2 months, like maybe like 13.5, 4, in the sense that it doesn't affect any immediate decisions we make now, but what it will help us guide like the engineering direction, so that we don't box ourselves up into a box too early. Yeah, maybe Eric, you can add some more color to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's the perfect. I mean, the research that's relevant to stuff that we might want to prioritize in like 13.4, 13.5 would be the stuff about managing that merge request flow and surfacing some more of the information about the publishing, and maybe saving drafts and things like that. But the larger research questions, a couple months is probably just fine. What's our, so we get some usage statistics from our users. We don't have very many. I'm looking now, and we right now have rolling average or rolling total of 23 monthly active users. So most of them being internal, but we do have some external users that have either mentioned us on issues or like I don't think we have like personal identifiable information in the static site editor, but how would we go about, or can we go about recruiting people from like usage statistics? Is there any way to engage people, I guess, without them having reached out first? That's a little creepy, obviously. We might not even have that information, which would probably be better, But if we did have that information, have we ever used that to recruit?
I am not 100% sure. I know that recently one of our researchers on the growth team has been looking into sending out emails, like pulling a list from, I think from, was it Periscope? Like finding a list of users based off some criteria in Periscope and then using that to create a mailing list that might be related. Maybe if you can kind of show me the usage data and then we can see if that's possible. But
yeah, I can send you a link. We have a dashboard now, which is great. Thanks to Sean. One avenue I could think of now would be, I'm pretty sure we know what projects use it. We might not know what people are publishing using it, but we know what projects have integrated the static site editor because the path to the project gets sent in to the editor itself. So we could potentially go on to those projects as people and just leave comments and ask in there, assuming they're not private, you know, we wouldn't have access to them. But even that, I'm not sure. It might cross a line. So we can talk about it. I'll talk about it with the product team also.
Okay, that sounds good. Maybe experimental, but it might also work. So
yeah,
try.
Well, I think that's it for our agenda. Any other topics or questions now that we've got some extra visitors? Thanks for joining, by the way.
You're welcome.
A lot of times it's like me and Michael or sometimes Derek or Chad will join because they're on the West Coast.
Well, I look forward to joining more of them because I just want to see what's going on and get deeper into it. So
yeah. Great. Well, let me stop the recording.